This is a 14-gallon Endler colony dirted tank that I set up 8 days ago. I'm not a videographer. A lot of these fish are 1/4 inch or smaller, and they really blend into the substrate. So what I'm really going to be doing is talking, and I'm not sure how great the video is going to be. So there's my disclaimer. I'm making this video partly to support Father Fish, who is a YouTuber who has been teaching old school methods, dirted tank old school methods to newbies. And I've been keeping tanks without any tech for a really long time. Sometimes I use air. If I'm keeping a species that needs current or more oxygen, then I will do that. But I don't use filters. I don't keep species that need heaters. And I have not paid much attention to what's going on in the hobby in terms of equipment and things. And there's just a lot of reliance on equipment. I'm not suggesting anyone run filterless tanks, but there's a lot of reliance on equipment and chemicals that you can pour in your tank, and quick start stuff, and algicides, and injecting canister CO2, and there's just a lot going on I hadn't paid much attention to, and I just can't imagine how overwhelming it could be for a newbie. So I think that Father Fish's method, known as the dirted tank also, Diana Wallsted's method is similar. I think it's a great way for newbies to get into the hobby and have a pretty foolproof way of maintaining a tank without spending a lot of money and, relatively anxiety-free. So, I'm going to briefly talk about how I set up the tank. I'm going to try and keep doing short progress videos every couple of weeks. And at the end, if I have any rant, which keeps coming up, which is why I haven't made this video. I've tried. I'm gonna try and save it till the end, or edit it and put it at the end. Okay. This tank is really cloudy because I did not wash this play sand properly. It's Quikrete brand play sand, and I thought I did, but this tank has been really, really cloudy since I set it up. Hard to tell in this light, but the substrate has 1 inch of soil that I dug out of my backyard and let dry in the sun, and then lightened up with sphagnum moss and worm castings. And then there's 2 inches of play sand on top of that. Now, Father Fish has a supplement that you can purchase. He also has the recipe for folks who want to mix their own that he uses that adds more minerals and will buffer the water more over time, buffer it up, keep the pH up. I decided not to add anything to buffer this because I've been using this mix, actually this mix with peat moss instead of sphagnum, for years. And I've lived in this house for 21 years, so it's the same soil. So I'm just going to stick with what I have because my water out of the tap is neutral and my tanks tend to stay neutral. They drop down to maybe 6.8, 6.7 over a number of years. So I didn't put any additives in there, but it's not a bad idea, particularly for people who want to keep harder water, more alkaline water with higher pH. Okay, so I rinsed the sand. I had my mix on the bottom. I made that into a mud, put that on the bottom, and then I rinsed the sand and put that on top. And filled it up with dechlorinated water. And I was not able to plant that night because it was so cloudy I couldn't see what I was doing. But I did put the fish in that night. I'm following Father Fish's method, and he always puts the fish in right away. And I'm perfectly comfortable with that because I don't use filters. I'm not waiting for anything to cycle. I use plants to filter my tanks, and all these plants came out of other tanks with the exception of the marsh pennywort, which I collected the day that I got the things that I put in the tank from the pond that I'll get to. So the only rooted plants I have here are dwarf Sagittaria. That's all I plan to have in there. It's actually 21 rather scraggly looking plants in there. Endlers are pretty hard to catch. Dwarf Sag, it'll get pretty tall in the back. It's already about 9 inches, but it's not going to take over the way swords or vals would. So I'm not going to put any other rooted plants in here. I have a piece of driftwood with some Christmas moss and a tiny little Anubias nana on there. When I set up the tank, I also included leaves and silt and water from a pond that I can walk to from my house. I also added water from my outdoor tubs, which are starting to warm up, which are, they have fish in them outside. They have gambusia in them, but the gambusia don't tend to eat the smaller copepods. So there's some life in there already, not as much as there will be this summer. And I poured that in the tank. And these are pure Endlers. Poecilia wengi. They are not guppy hybrids. Most of the Endlers that you'll see on the commercial market have been hybridized with guppies, unless you get them from a breeder or a niche, store, local fish store. You're likely to have hybridized Endlers. These are not, and they're extremely hardy, and they can tolerate incredible temperature swings. I've had them outside in the 40s. They can easily go up in the high 90s. They are from a lagoon, and they're used to very low oxygen, murky water, so I don't have to aerate their tank. I think I mentioned, maybe I didn't, there are about 30 Endlers of different sizes in this tank, anywhere from 1/4 inch long to 3/4 inches, and then there are 2 adult males. I put 15 or so of the babies in the night I set up the tank, and then yesterday, which was day 7, I added another 15 and the 2 male Endlers. I did do one 10% water change today, because I noticed the male Endlers are a little stressed. None of the others are, and I noticed one of them scratching on the sand bed. So I did a small water change. That's about 10%. I haven't seen any other alarming behavior. I don't use test kits anymore, but they're not a bad idea for newbies. Okay. As far as food, I haven't added any. There's been no need to. These Endlers eat algae like champs. The larger ones eat snail eggs. I've been watching them eat masses of snail eggs. They've finished off 2.5 of them already. There's tons of copepods in here. They're constantly picking at things. They're always pooping. So I'm not worried about feeding them right now. I have a culture of scuds and snails and copepods, and I'll be putting copepods in here. There are some scuds in here already. As they breed, the smaller ones the babies will be small enough for the adults to eat. I will be crushing some bladder snails and putting those in the tank. I will, by winter time, I'll be back to doing some brine shrimp, but I'm not going to need to hatch any for this tank because my outdoor tubs that have fish in them are already cranking up to be producing a whole lot of cyclops. I mean, just all I do is pull out a jar and there's just hundreds of cyclops. So I'll just be pouring water from my tubs in here all summer. That's how I'll be feeding these guys. I mean, they're tiny fish, and in fact, in this colony tank, I do have some females that are adult size. They get up to about 2 inches, even 2.5 sometimes. I will be culling females out of here. Probably by the time they're about 3/4 inches long. I may keep a few in with my sunfish. I have bantam sunfish, but I'll be feeding most of them. I'll be giving these away to anyone that wants them, but I have been culling by feeding them to my sunfish when they're small, because you got to do something when you got Livebearers in a colony tank. But again, these are babies, so there won't be any serious breeding happening for a while. So the only other thing I wanted to talk about is why I like Father Fish's method so much, and why I think it's so great for newbies in particular. Partly because that's how I started when I really got serious about breeding fish and joined my first fish club in the early 90s. There were some gentlemen in that club who were all older World War II vets who were approaching retirement, and they all had multiple fish rooms that they ran on shoestring budgets. And they taught me to dig up dirt in my yard, or better yet, get mud from a river. The gold was river sand that was live. You didn't want to rinse it. You didn't want to kill anything in it. Similar to the idea of live sand in a saltwater tank or live rock in a saltwater tank. So that's how I started when I really got serious and started getting a lot of tanks. I was digging up organic dirt and letting it dry in the sun, and often just using that. You know, sometimes I didn't lighten it up at all. I never had any problems. But here in the South, it's really heavy clay. I was in New England, and it was different. So this always worked really well, and I haven't kept a dirted tank in about 10 years, but I'm excited about it, particularly with fish this small, because all of the additional bioactivity is adding so much microflora and fauna that I don't anticipate, like I said, other than hatching some brine shrimp every once in a while this winter, I don't anticipate having to feed these fish very often at all. You know, I think of it as I feed my tanks, because I'm pretty much all live food at this point. I keep dried around, and I've been pretty good about trying to keep my fish acclimated to dry should I decide to give them away. But I think, you know, I'm just not going to be doing that anymore. I actually find it more work. Okay, it's a little while later, and it's dark outside now. I've basically discussed the setup. Now I'm just going to talk a little bit more about this old school method, deep sand beds, why I don't personally use any filtration, things like that. This, I should mention, this is directly in front of a eastern window that does have filtered light, and I prefer to put my tanks in front of windows as much as possible. If I have to filter the light, then that's fine. You don't want your tank to get too warm from the sun, but other than that, I think it's really beneficial for the fish, just like it is for us. And, you know, I really like looking at a really well-lit tank during the day. This one's still cloudy, as I had mentioned. I didn't rinse the sand well enough. I thought I had. It's been years since I used anything but black diamond blasting grit, and this sand is really, really fine. So I'm still dealing with that, and because I don't have a filter pulling it out, it's going to be a little while longer. I didn't mention, people might be wondering what this sort of stick in the right corner is. That's a money tree plant. I'm just experimenting with that. There's another one. I'm trying to see if I can get them to grow in water. Please excuse the plaster around my windows. I had my windows replaced recently, and the whole room needs to be painted, but apparently I'd rather set up a fish tank that'll have to be moved so I can paint my living room. At any rate, okay, so as I mentioned, I'm primarily interested in the active substrate for the additional biolife. The concept of the balanced aquarium has been around since the Victorian era, and I like to joke that I practice post-Victorian fish keeping. And in some ways, I do a lot of the same things that they did. I have lots of books, a really nice library of both digital and print books from the 1850s and later. And they were doing a lot of things right and a lot of things wrong, but a lot of things right, without the benefit of test kits and, I mean, even electricity. So, I like the peaceful, calm, quietness of a still water tank. I like not having any equipment taking up any space. And, you know, the nice thing about having this progress video is that people will get to see how it progresses and just how clear the water actually will become. I suppose I could show another tank for that maybe next time, along with an update. So the idea of the balanced aquarium is, of course, similar to the idea of an ecosystem, and you'll actually hear people call their tanks ecosystems, and of course that's absolutely ridiculous. This is a closed system. It cannot exist without our intervention. But what is true is that in greater biodiversity is greater stability. The more microorganisms that are living in our tanks competing for resources, along with macroorganisms, the more stability there is, because the less likely it is that one population is going to take over. So one of the primary reasons, you know, other than aesthetics, that I don't use filters is that I don't want to be removing copepods. In the summertime, there are so many cyclops swimming around in these tanks that, you know, the fish can't eat them all, and they will survive until they are eaten, unless there's a filter in there that sucks them to the sponge or up the intake. And, you know, that's not what I want. In addition to that, I'm not interested in filtering my tanks primarily with beneficial bacteria. There's plenty of beneficial bacteria in the tank. It's on just about every surface, not as much on the glass as people like to think, but it's everywhere else. But plants take up ammonia directly, especially floating plants who are not limited to the CO2 that is in the water. They get it out of the air. So rather than the bacteria, which goes through this two-stage process that we're, you know, familiar with, you know, nitrifies it and then turns the nitrites into nitrates, the plants are taking it up directly, and you still have the beneficial bacteria to do things, and you've also got that bacteria to do things like break down matter, dead matter, into detritus. So that, you know, everything's important, but I don't really want to provide a club med for beneficial bacteria in the form of a filter, because that's not how I want to. That's not how I want to take care of ammonia in my tank, and I don't want a filter competing with my plants for the nutrients. Now, I don't do a lot of water changes. I will if I see any sort of an issue, if I think there's a reason to do a water change, but you know, there's no reason to change healthy water. So I do top off, and I top off quite a bit because of the open top of the tank. We have pretty low total dissolved solids in our water. I actually love our water here in Memphis. It's filtered by a sand aquifer, and comes about 80 TDS out of the tap, even after 4 or 5 years. My tanks primarily with top offs are still sitting at around 350 at the highest. So, you know, I don't have to worry about a lot of buildup of different metals or anything through topping off the way I might with different chemistry, different water chemistry. Oh, food. Like I said, I'm pro live food. I used to be pro frozen food, but all the frozen food I can find locally has guar gum in it, and that was a practice that started in fish hatcheries, and just to make the stool sort of stick together and break down more slowly and stay together so that it can be more easily mechanically removed. And that's the opposite of what I want. I don't have any mechanical filtration, so I want everything to break down pretty rapidly. So live food keeps my tanks incredibly clean. Like I mentioned before, other than brine shrimp, everything that I feed can live in the tank until it's eaten. I'm also not feeding dried foods that have lots of fillers in them, like wheat, corn. There's all kinds of fillers that fish don't properly digest that end up then polluting a tank in dry fish food, with the exception of bug bites is made of fly larvae, 100%, I think, soldier fly larvae. Of course, you can buy, you know, if I am going to feed dry, then I want to feed whole dried foods, dried Daphnia, dried bloodworms, things like that. So not feeding any dry food at all, though, whether it has fillers or not, helps to keep my tank cleaner. Especially like my bantam sunfish tank. They're very aggressive eaters, and they just sort of tear apart food, and then the tiny little bits of dust flies off of all that dried food and gets in the water column and eventually settles. And it has to be dealt with by your system. And I'm not introducing a lot of that. So that's another reason that I don't have to do a lot of water changes, that everything stays healthy and that these tanks are incredibly low maintenance. So that's plenty. I'll try and do an update in a week or two, and just continue to update until maybe, you know, everything's grown in. And yeah, thanks for watching.